Why would one of the greatest generals the world has ever known, Hannibal Barca, suddenly find himself outmaneuvered by a Roman commander years his junior? And how, after nearly 2 decades of humiliation, did Rome finally engineer the plan that stopped him? To answer that, we must begin not with Hannibal's triumphant march across the Alps, nor even with his devastation at Cannae, but at the very moment the two titans finally faced each other directly, the Battle of Zama, 202 BCE. Before we dive in, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content like this. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Picture the plains of North Africa. The air is heavy with dust kicked up by war elephants chained in restless formations. Roman legionaries stand shield to shield, their lines drawn up in a way their enemies have not witnessed before. At the edges of the battlefield, Numidian cavalry pivot restlessly, one of the deciding factors yet to be unleashed. In the distance, two commanders, Scipio Africanus of Rome and Hannibal Barca of Carthage, each weigh not only the lives of their soldiers, but the fate of their civilizations. Rome's survival hangs on this confrontation. For 16 years, Hannibal had toyed with the Republic like a predator with its prey. At Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae, he annihilated Roman legions in slaughter that shook the Mediterranean world to its core. And yet, here at Zama, Rome dares to call him back for one final reckoning. The stakes? Nothing less than control of the known world. A Carthaginian victory would mean Rome's collapse, the unraveling of its alliances, and potentially the end of Latin dominance before it had even truly begun. A Roman victory, conversely, would not just terminate the Second Punic War, it would propel Rome from struggling republic to preeminent Mediterranean power, paving the road to outright empire. But how did Rome, battered, bloodied, and nearly broken, come to stand here with renewed confidence? And what hidden stratagem allowed Scipio, a general who had once witnessed Hannibal's terrifying genius firsthand, to outthink the master of ambush and deception? To understand Zama, we step back into the broader context of the Second Punic War. This was not just a war of battles, it was a test of endurance, of resources, and of systems. Unlike Hannibal, who relied often on mercenary contingents and wavering political support from Carthage's oligarchs, Rome drew from an inexhaustible well, her citizenry. Even when crushed at Cannae, where perhaps 50,000 Romans lay dead in a single afternoon, the Republic staggered but did not fall. As one historian observed, any other Mediterranean state might have sued for peace. Rome vowed to fight on. That decision shaped history. Now consider Hannibal's personal stakes on that day at Zama. He was not merely a general called back late in the war, reluctantly summoned by desperate Carthaginian leaders. He was the son of Hannibal Barca, who had once sworn his child to eternal hatred of Rome. Every maneuver on that battlefield carried the weight of a lifelong vendetta. Hannibal's genius was sharpened by personal oath. Failure was not simply military, it would be personal dishonor, a betrayal of his family's legacy. Scipio too bore heavy personal weight. He had fought at Cannae as a young and untested officer, barely escaping with his life while elder statesmen perished. He saw firsthand Rome's greatest calamity, and it seared into him a belief that Rome needed commanders willing to think unconventionally. Scipio was not merely seeking victory for the Republic. He sought redemption for every Roman slaughtered under Hannibal's maneuvers. Here lay his chance at vindication. Yet the true revelation at Zama wasn't in the clash of wills alone. Rome had engineered something subtle. Scipio devised a battlefield plan specifically tailored to neutralize Hannibal's war elephants, those immense beasts designed to terrorize infantry. Traditional armies often broke under their charge. Horses bolted, men scattered. But Scipio instructed his legions differently. He reorganized them into columns with deliberate corridors, gaping lanes that seemed almost like disorder to the uninitiated. This calculated structure would channel the elephants harmlessly through, where Roman skirmishers could harass and immobilize them. It was as much psychological warfare as it was tactical innovation. The legionaries, no longer fearing a chaotic stampede, stood ready. Consider standing in their sandals. Before you, a wall of elephants' trumpets, their massive bulk advancing rapidly. If you hold formation, you trust in the commander's design. You trust in the strange new spacing of this legion that looks so different compared to the usual manipular checkerboard. Break in panic reigns. Hold, and the elephant's surge might just collapse into futility. What would you have done in that moment? This, then, was the gamble Scipio made, a hidden plan rooted in psychological steadiness and structural innovation. By teaching his soldiers not to resist the elephant's charge head-on, but to flow around and through it like water, he turned Hannibal's devastating weapon into a liability. But before we leap ahead into that clash, we must step back and ask, how exactly did Rome cultivate this kind of adaptability? Why was Rome able to absorb disaster after disaster, only to rise again stronger? The answer lies not in a single battle, but in the nature of the Roman military machine itself. It's here we pivot, because Zama wasn't merely a duel of two men, it was the collision of systems. Carthage's mercenary reliance and Hannibal's brilliance on one side, Rome's disciplined citizen-soldier military engine on the other. And that clash would decide the trajectory of the ancient world. Unknown to Hannibal as his elephants pawed the dust at Zama, another battle was unfolding. One built over decades of drilling fields, manipular innovations, citizen obligations, and political pressure that forged Rome's war machine. Before we witness the decisive blow at Zama, we must first understand what stood behind every Roman legionary shield. Because the secret of Roman victory was only partly Scipio's clever plan. The rest was the iron framework of military discipline, the relentless system that refused to let Rome die. Why was Rome able to recover from disasters that would have shattered any other state? Why, after witnessing entire armies annihilated before their eyes, did the Republic not surrender but return again and again with renewed ferocity? To understand how Scipio Africanus could outmaneuver Hannibal at Zama, we must first look at the Roman military machine itself. This was no ordinary army. It was a system, a living engine of war, built from the very bones of Roman society, and it would become the most formidable force the ancient world had ever seen. At the heart of this machine stood the legion. Unlike the Macedonian phalanx, a dense forest of spears that relied on rigid cohesion, the Roman legion was fluid and flexible, divided into smaller tactical blocks called maniples. Think of them as independent pawns within a vast war engine, able to move, retreat, or advance without breaking the cohesion of the whole. This checkerboard formation gave Rome unrivaled adaptability on the battlefield. An enemy might expect one solid wall of troops, but instead faced a formation that breathed, shifted, and flowed like a living organism. When Scipio stood at Zama, this flexibility allowed him to do what no army before him had managed: create deliberate corridors designed for a very specific purpose, to channel Hannibal's war elephants harmlessly through the lines. But formations were only the skeleton of Rome's power. Muscle and sinew came from relentless training. From the day recruits entered the ranks, their lives were consumed by drills, marches, and unyielding discipline. Wooden swords and shields heavier than real ones conditioned them so that true combat felt light and swift. They marched long distances, carrying staggering burdens, so much so that generations later, soldiers would be nicknamed Marius's mules. Endurance was drilled into them until exhaustion became second nature. A legion that could outlast its enemy even before drawing swords was already halfway to victory. Discipline was more than training, it was survival. Punishments for failure or cowardice were brutal, and the most terrifying was decimation. If a unit faltered in battle, 1 in 10 men was executed by their own comrades. Imagine standing in line, watching lots drawn, knowing death might come not from the enemy, but from your brothers in arms if you had let fear disgrace the formation. Such severity meant that, when the order came to hold a shield wall, Romans did not break. At Zama, when an avalanche of elephants thundered toward them, only the discipline of such men could hold steady while others would scatter. Now picture this moment. You are a legionary, sweat dripping down your temples beneath a helmet that feels both heavy and suffocating. The ground starts to shake. The sound grows, a thunder like the world itself is splitting. And then you see them. Enormous tusks, towers of flesh, beasts bred to terrify by sheer size. In any ordinary army, men would panic, gaps would open, and once fear took root, the front line would collapse. But you've been drilled not to fight against the stampede, but to trust the new formation. The men beside you shift, lanes open like trapdoors, and you know that if you hold steady, the monsters will crash harmlessly through those corridors instead of smashing your line. It is discipline, not courage alone, that makes such steadiness possible. The weapons that filled Roman hands and added to this cruel efficiency. The short stabbing gladius was ideal for thrusts in the press of battle, far deadlier in close quarters than the sweeping slashes of longer swords. The pila were ingenious javelins, iron tips designed to bend on impact, lodging in enemy shields, weighing them down, and preventing them from being thrown back. And the large curved scutum shield turned each man into part of a walking wall, protecting the body from shoulders to knees. Archaeological finds show us how standardized these weapons became, mass-produced like tools from a single workshop. When Hannibal's mercenaries stood across the field at Zama, they carried weapons and armor from dozens of cultures. Their diversity was their weakness. Rome's strength was its uniformity, its seamless coordination, the way every piece of the war engine fit together. We often speak of battles as isolated contests of courage, but the true secret of Rome's military power lies in what happened before battles ever began. Logistics, infrastructure, and relentless organization kept Rome fighting after defeats that would have left others gasping for peace. Their legendary roads weren't built as tourist attractions, but as arteries of war. Soldiers could march across Italy in half the time of their enemies. Supplies could flow unbroken, and communications remained steady where rivals faltered. Hannibal captured cities, ravaged countrysides, shattered armies, but he could never break those deeper arteries that fed Roman resilience. And then there was the political engine. In Rome, military command and political advancement were inseparable. Magistrates and consuls were expected to lead armies. Success brought prestige, failure brought disgrace. This meant there was almost always a queue of ambitious Romans eager for commands, eager for opportunities to prove themselves. Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries and hesitant oligarchs who guarded their wealth. Rome relied on citizens for whom service was both duty and ambition. It made their military not just an army, but the very skeleton of the republic itself. This civic connection can't be overstated. To fight for Rome wasn't just to serve a wage. It was to fight for your family, for your ancestors, for the very city whose gods watched from their temples. The common farmer who left to join the legions knew his land might be burned, his brother already dead at Trasimene or Cannae, but he also knew that his voice in the assembly, his very citizenship, depended on Rome's survival. Hannibal could destroy armies, but he could not destroy Rome's will to fight. Every loss stoked its determination for revenge. By the later stages of the war, Rome wasn't just surviving, it was adapting. Hannibal's brilliance at Cannae had exposed the weaknesses of the manipular formation. But instead of folding, Rome studied its own defeat. Scipio Africanus rose not as a traditional Roman general, but as a hybrid one, a commander who had learned from Hannibal's very playbook. He absorbed Carthaginian methods, studied deception and fluid maneuver, and fused them into Rome's structured discipline. It was the combination of this personal ingenuity with the entrenched might of the machine that made Scipio so dangerous. So when he stood at Zama, ordering those strange gaps in his lines, he wasn't betraying Roman practice. He was perfecting it. Only a military system drilled in discipline, obedience, and flexibility could execute such a maneuver without dissolving into chaos. What looked radical was in fact the purest expression of Roman strength. Adapt, learn, incorporate, and make it part of the machine. The Roman army at Zama was not improvisation. It was the outcome of centuries of evolution, drilled into citizen soldiers who believed that their identity was inseparable from victory. That is why Rome endured Hannibal's storms and outlasted his brilliance. It had built not merely an army, but a war machine, and by the end of the Second Punic War, the machine had learned to outthink even the greatest general alive. At Zama, Hannibal relied on the shock of elephants, the loyalty of mercenaries, and flashes of his former genius. Scipio relied on the machine behind him, an army that was Rome itself, and on the knowledge that this was no longer the republic that had blundered into Cannae. This was a republic reforged by defeat, made iron by disaster, and engineered to be indestructible. Yet to truly see Scipio's brilliance and to understand how one final battle could reverse nearly 2 decades of humiliation, we must revisit the darkest days of the Republic. For before Zama, there was Cannae. Before Rome's triumph stood Rome's annihilation. To grasp the magnitude of Zama, we must relive the battlefield where Hannibal showed the world what genius could do, and where Scipio first learned what it meant to survive the worst defeat in Roman history. Why did Hannibal's name inspire such dread across Rome that mothers invoked it to frighten their children for generations? Why did citizens, who had once believed themselves invincible, sit trembling in silence inside the Senate after hearing the casualty lists of Cannae? To understand the triumph at Zama, we must first descend into the valley of Rome's greatest defeats, because it was in those moments of annihilation that the Republic learned the hard lessons which Scipio Africanus would eventually turn against Hannibal himself. The Second Punic War had opened with disaster for Rome. Hannibal's audacious march across the Alps had stunned the Mediterranean world. Against all odds, he brought his army, reduced but unbroken, into Italy itself. It was a feat as much psychological as military, one of those rare moments when a single commander redefined what seemed possible. For Rome, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last nearly 2 decades. Hannibal did not merely invade Italy, he bled it year after year. And the bloodiest of his victories came at Cannae in 216 BCE. The catastrophe of Cannae lives in history as a textbook of annihilation. Rome, desperate for a decisive blow, fielded a force perhaps twice the size of Hannibal's, close to 82,000 men. It was a massive army designed to crush Carthage through sheer numbers. But here Hannibal revealed his deadliest gift, deception in plain sight. He deployed his men in a crescent, putting his weaker troops in the center, deliberately offering them as bait. Rome, overconfident in mass, drove its legions straight into the center, eager to punch a hole and break the Carthaginian line. The crescent buckled, but it did not break. It bent slowly backward, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into a trap. Hannibal's elite African infantry, concealed at the flanks, pivoted like doors swinging shut. At that moment, the hammer fell. Carthaginian cavalry, commanded with ruthless precision, routed the Roman horsemen, circled back, and closed the pocket from behind. The result was the complete encirclement of the Roman army. Men were packed so tightly they couldn't raise a weapon. Over 50,000 Romans lay dead by day's end, their corpses lining the field in grotesque heaps. What would you have done had you been a Roman commander watching your army swallowed before your very eyes? Retreat was impossible. The field became a slaughterhouse, a demonstration to the world that Roman confidence was no shield against Hannibal's cunning. Even so, Rome's response was not surrender. That was Hannibal's great paradox. Though he shattered Rome on the battlefield, strategically, he never broke it at the core. And that resilience, born amid horror, would be what Scipio later carried to Africa. Among those who survived Cannae was a young tribune named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was only in his late teens, but the experience seared itself into him. He saw firsthand the cost of arrogance, the danger of underestimating a cunning opponent, and the need for armies to think as well as fight. Many Romans licked their wounds and sought vengeance blindly. Scipio absorbed the lesson instead. Hannibal had not won through brute strength. He had won through manipulation, psychology, and precision. Someday Scipio would need to answer that weapon with one of his own. The years after Cannae were grim. Hannibal roamed Italy freely, though he never took Rome itself. Cities defected to him, allies crumbled, and Roman fields lay ravaged. Yet Rome's stubbornness proved incredible. They refused to negotiate peace. They raised new legions again and again, often composed of freed slaves, penal recruits, and mere boys pressed early into service. Unlike Carthage, Rome had a nearly inexhaustible reservoir of manpower fueled by citizenship and desperate survival. As years dragged on, Hannibal's advantage began to erode. Carthage's Senate, wary of his power, withheld reinforcements. They feared him as much as they feared Rome. His victories became isolated flashes of genius, but he lacked the resources to deliver the killing blow. Rome, meanwhile, turned to a war of attrition. They harried Hannibal's allies, avoided pitched battles, and bided their time. Slowly the tide turned. It was during this phase that Scipio Africanus truly rose. Sent to Spain to wrest control from Hannibal's brothers, Scipio proved fearless yet calculating. In Spain, he learned how to exploit morale, how to ambush, and how to turn enemies into allies. He studied not only Roman practices, but also Carthaginian innovation. Spain became his testing ground, a theater where he developed the taste for bold maneuvers coupled with iron discipline. Victories there gave him prestige, and when he returned to Rome, he began to press for a more radical strategy: take the war directly to Africa. Consider this for a moment. Rome was still bleeding from Hannibal's presence in Italy. The conservative instinct was to keep fighting him defensively, to avoid further risk. But Scipio saw something different. He saw that Hannibal was strongest when Rome came to him weakened and overconfident, as at Cannae. But in Carthage's own homeland, with their political factions divided and their allies wavering, Hannibal would be forced into a reactive role. Scipio gambled that the man who had humiliated Rome in Italy could be trapped if the battlefield were chosen carefully. The gamble was extraordinary, and Rome's Senate almost refused him. Only through a mixture of his charisma, his supporters' influence, and his undeniable record in Spain did Scipio win command. With that order, he carried the legions into North Africa. There the dominoes began to fall. Massinissa, king of Numidia, abandoned Carthage and allied with Rome, bringing cavalry that would prove decisive. Carthage, panicked, was forced at last to recall their great son Hannibal from Italy. After 16 years in the field, Hannibal marched home to meet the challenge. One can only imagine the weight upon Hannibal as he set foot again on African soil, recalled not in triumph but in desperation. It was a bitter reckoning. His city had squandered the fruits of his victories, squandered the moment after Cannae when Rome staggered and might have fallen. Now he was to defend Carthage with men not of his hardened Italian campaigns, but with hastily assembled force, raw levies, and unreliable mercenaries. Yet Hannibal was still Hannibal. Even diminished, his genius flickered. He arranged his army with elephants at the fore, infantry in depth, and cavalry wings ready to sweep the flanks. He hoped to smash the Roman lines with shock, then envelop as he had done at Cannae. But here is where Scipio's years of observation bore fruit. He guessed Hannibal's reliance on elephants and prepared accordingly. He organized his legions in unusual columns, leaving avenues open like funnels. It was a subtle trap. Elephants running into the lines would find gaps rather than meet resistance, shunted aside and neutralized. Behind these corridors, Roman skirmishers waited with javelins and missiles to torment the confused beasts. What at Cannae had been arrogance, the Romans pressing into a trap, was now adaptation. Scipio, like a patient student, had taken Hannibal's lessons and sharpened them into his own blade. And so the stage was set. Two commanders, one scarred by years of humiliation, but now armed with newfound cunning, the other the once unstoppable conqueror, brought back to defend his home. Both men understood that this was no ordinary battle. This was the reckoning of an entire war, the pivot of civilizations. For Carthage, survival. For Rome, destiny. In 202 BCE, on the plains near Zama, master and student, predator and prey, met for the final duel. What followed was an exchange of brilliance and desperation, of cavalry charges and tactical gambles, of elephants and spears, a clash whose echoes resound across the centuries. And at its heart lay one question. Could Scipio, who had once fled Hannibal's slaughter at Cannae, now turn the trap against the man who invented it? The morning of Zama dawned hot and dry, the kind of day when the sun already carried a cruel weight before the battle even began. Dust hung heavy in the air, stirred by thousands of feet shuffling into place. Across the plain, two armies confronted each other, mirror images in size, yet utterly different in spirit. For Carthage, this was a hastily patched host. For Rome, a machine honed by decades of agony and resolve. And standing at the center of each line were two men who had haunted each other's thoughts for years, Hannibal Barca and Publius Cornelius Scipio. Both men understood the stakes. For Hannibal, defeat meant the destruction of everything he had fought for since boyhood, the undoing of his family's oath to humble Rome. For Scipio, failure would bring not only personal ruin but the annihilation of a republic that had entrusted him with its last gamble. History itself seemed to hold its breath. Hannibal placed his elephants at the forefront of his line, nearly 80 of them, towers of muscle and fury whose trumpeting rolled like thunder. Behind them he positioned his mercenary troops, the first layer of his army. Behind the mercenaries came Carthage's conscripted citizen soldiers, many untested and lacking conviction. And finally, as his reserve, Hannibal marshaled his veterans, the hardened survivors of Italy's long campaigns, men who had followed him across Alps and Apennines, who had tasted victory at Cannae and endured the long exile that followed. They were his last hope, his steel core. Scipio saw the arrangement and made his adjustments. Instead of the traditional checkerboard of maniples, he reformed his legions into open corridors, lanes leading forward like the streets of a city. These corridors were no accident. They were the heart of his plan. When the elephants charged, those channels would draw them in harmlessly. Archers, slingers, and velites, the light Roman troops, lined the gaps, ready to pierce and harass the animals, turning Hannibal's might into chaos. Behind them, Scipio's heavy infantry waited with the lethal calm of men who trusted the system more than their own nerves. Imagine yourself there. The ground begins to shake, dust surges forward, and a line of elephants the size of houses lumbers toward you. Their tusks are sharpened, tips glimmering with iron. War cries echo, hooves pound, and even the bravest heart might quail. But in those critical moments, obedience mattered more than instinct. The Roman soldiers held formation. At the last instant, as the elephants thundered home, the columns peeled open and created the lanes. Instead of a shield wall to smash, the beasts found nothing but yawning corridors and a storm of missiles. Arrows and javelins tore into their thick hides. Some, panicked by pain, turned and crashed back into Carthage's own lines. Others stumbled uselessly through the Roman channels, only to be cut down by swords and spears. The great weapon of terror had failed. Scipio's first gamble had worked. Now came the infantry clash. Hannibal's mercenaries surged forward against the Roman front ranks. They fought with ferocity, drawing heavily on Gauls and Iberians who lived for war. For a time, the fighting was desperate, swords clashing, shields splitting, dust turning to mud with blood. Yet already cracks began to show. Hannibal's mercenaries were skilled, but not united. They fought for pay, for loot, not for civic survival. Behind them loomed Carthaginian citizen soldiers, pressured to advance, but resentment flared. Instead of cohesion between the first and second lines, tension grew. Some mercenaries fell back, clashing with the unwilling citizens behind them. What should have been a reinforcement dissolved into angry bickering, a fault line Hannibal could not repair in time. Scipio pressed the advantage. His maniples drove hard and steadily forward, the sound of Roman horns directing each push with terrifying rhythm. The machine was working, one relentless grind of shield and sword. Step, thrust, mechanical, bloody, unstoppable. Hannibal grimaced and held his reserve. He had expected the elephants to punch open Rome's line, but that moment was lost. Now the battle hung in balance. Only his veterans remained untouched, his Italians who had survived the long campaign. He waited, reading the field, letting the Romans exhaust themselves against the chaos of his disrupted front lines. But while infantry locked in combat, another contest unfolded at the wings. Here, Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, unleashed by Scipio, clashed with Carthage's horsemen. It was a furious melee, dust clouds boiling, riders toppling in waves. For a time, the cavalry fight was inconclusive, but slowly, bit by bit, the Numidians gained the edge. Massinissa, once Hannibal's ally, now struck with the fury of betrayal, turned allegiance. Carthage's horse scattered, leaving Hannibal's flanks naked. And when the Roman cavalry completed its rout, it did exactly what had doomed Rome at Cannae. It circled away, preparing to strike from the rear. Hannibal knew the echo all too well. Years earlier, it was his cavalry that had closed the trap around Rome. Now he felt the ghost of that victory turning against him. His veterans, those few thousand men who remained faithful, finally surged forward, clashing with the bulk of Rome's legions. The fighting was apocalyptic. Two exhausted, iron-forged corps smashing into one another at close range. Shields cracked like thunderclaps. Swords stabbed relentlessly. Men fell in heaps. and neither side gave ground. For a moment, the battle seemed suspended in perfect balance, Hannibal's finest against Rome's best. Every lesson of war distilled into that press of shields. What would decide it? Sheer endurance. Scipio ordered his men to hold, reminding them, through his trumpeter's harsh blasts, that reinforcements approached. And then it came. Roman and Numidian cavalry, victorious at the wings, swept in from behind. The scene that followed was the reversal of Cannae. Hannibal's army, compressed between Roman infantry to the front and Roman allied cavalry at the rear, found itself trapped. The jaws of encirclement closed, only this time, it was Carthage that stood in the slaughter pen. The veterans fought with grim determination, refusing to surrender. They had marched Italy for 16 years, and many would rather die than yield. But courage was not enough. Rome's machine ground them down, sword thrust by sword thrust. The elephants had failed, the mercenaries had broken, the citizens had scattered, and now even Hannibal's corps was dying at the hands of men who once fled from them. Hannibal himself fought to the last, rallying survivors, personally directing units amid the storm. But even genius cannot reverse inevitability. By battle's end, Carthage's field army was annihilated. Tens of thousands lay dead. Hannibal escaped with only a handful of companions, not as conqueror, but as refugee in his own homeland. Scipio Africanus, once the frightened youth at Cannae, stood now as the master strategist of Zama, hailed as savior of the Republic. Rome had redeemed its greatest shame by reversing it upon the very man who inflicted it. In that moment, the Second Punic War ended. The Republic of Rome, battered but unbroken, had at last banished the fear of Hannibal. More than victory, this was vindication. The trap of Cannae had become the triumph of Zama. Yet even as celebrations erupted in Rome, deeper consequences stirred. Carthage's fate now hung in chains, forced into crippling peace terms. Hannibal, though alive, would spend his remaining years in exile, a man too dangerous for his own city, a wanderer among foreign courts. Rome, meanwhile, had proven not only stronger than Carthage, but stronger than catastrophe itself, and that meant the Mediterranean world would never be the same. But the battlefield does not exist alone. Behind every sword and shield stood alliances, betrayals, and political games. Rome's Senate, Carthage's oligarchs, Numidia's shifting loyalties, they all made Zama possible. If the battle was the climax, the intrigue was its foundation. To understand why Zama took place at all, we must step away from cavalry charges and shield walls and enter the dim corridors of politics, where victory was plotted before the first blow ever fell. Why did Zama even happen at all? Why did two of the greatest commanders of antiquity meet in a final, desperate reckoning in the dust of North Africa, rather than on the familiar fields of Italy? To answer that, we must turn from the noise of battle to the silence of chambers lit by oil lamps, to the backroom debates in Rome, the whispered arguments in Carthage, and the horse trading of kings whose choices shaped empires. Victory at Zama was born not only of discipline and tactics, but also of intrigue, power, betrayal, and political gamble. Rome, in the years after Cannae, was a republic gripped by fear and political fracture. Senators argued bitterly about how to respond to Hannibal. Some were cautious, urging negotiations after so many defeats. Others pointed to the very ethos of Rome: never surrender, never parley after defeat. Into this storm strode Publius Cornelius Scipio, a man both admired and distrusted. He was young, bold, and dangerously charismatic. For conservatives like Fabius Maximus, who had built his reputation on caution and a strategy of delay, Scipio's calls to carry the war into Africa seemed reckless. The Senate itself nearly blocked him, fearing to entrust the Republic's survival to a single brash commander. Scipio's supporters countered that boldness was Rome's only chance. Italy had been bleeding under Hannibal for more than a decade. To defeat him, they had to force him home. Scipio knew the Senate could still pull the command from his hands, so he appealed not only to politics but to people. He reminded Rome of his victories in Spain, of Cartagena's fall, of his ability to turn disaster into triumph. He embodied the Republic's resilience. At last, his vision prevailed, barely. His expedition across to Africa was as much a political coup as it was a military maneuver. He staked his career, his family honor, and his city's survival on the claim that Hannibal could be fought and broken on his own ground. Think of the pressure on his shoulders. If he failed, there would be no glory in retreat, only disgrace and execution. Carthage, meanwhile, was a city at war with itself. Hannibal's victories in Italy had never been fully embraced by the ruling oligarchs. Many of them distrusted him, the son of a populous general who had long challenged the Carthaginian elite. These noble families treated him as a weapon of convenience rather than the savior he might have been. At the crucial moment after Cannae, when Carthage could have flooded Italy with reinforcements to finish Rome, they hesitated. They argued that the war was costly, that Hannibal's ambitions endangered the city's trade wealth, that he might be too powerful to control. In that indecision lay Carthage's doom. When Scipio arrived in Africa years later, Carthage had no choice but to recall their prodigal son and beg him to defend the city he had once fought for without their support. Allies and vassals played their own games. Chief among them was Massinissa of Numidia, a brilliant cavalry commander whose domain neighbored Carthage. Massinissa once rode with Hannibal, but as Rome's shadow lengthened, he calculated where true power lay. Wavering between loyalty and ambition, he ultimately allied with Scipio, bringing with him an arm of cavalry so superb that it shifted the calculus of Zama. In many ways, it was Massinissa's betrayal of Carthage that sealed Hannibal's fate, even before a weapon was raised. For cavalry superiority made Hannibal's favored tactic, the encirclement, suddenly impossible. The dust cloud of Zama was shaped as much in Numidian palaces as in Roman camps. Politics was also personal. Hannibal returned to Carthage, knowing he came not as rescuer, but as scapegoat. The same senators who had starved him of reinforcements now demanded he somehow defend them from Scipio's invasion. His confidence was tempered by bitterness. He knew that Carthage's fate rested on him alone, that victory would save those who had doubted him, and defeat would condemn him as the man who lost everything. His personal stake was overwhelming, both a burden and a source of determination. Scipio's own political dangers were no less severe. His rise threatened rivals back in Rome, jealous senators who whispered that his brilliance might make him a king in all but name, a fearful echo for a republic proud of having cast off monarchs. Already political knives were sharpening in the Senate, ready to plunge should he stumble. Every maneuver he made in Africa was shadowed by these rivalries. Each camp he struck, each alliance he forged was ammunition not only against Carthage, but against those who doubted him at home. To lead Roman war was always also to wage a war in Rome itself. Espionage and negotiation played their part too. Before Zama, envoys crossed between Scipio and Hannibal, proposing terms. Hannibal himself, perhaps sensing Carthage's weakness, met Scipio in parley. Two masters of war, face to face without swords, weighing words instead of maneuvers. Accounts of their meeting differ, but its symbolism is powerful. Hannibal, who had once dictated terms by his victories, now offering peace and fear. Scipio, who had learned war at Hannibal's hands, refusing to be cowed and insisting that only unconditional Carthaginian submission would suit Rome. Imagine the heavy silence between them, the unspoken recognition that words were a mere prelude, that only the battlefield could resolve their rivalry. The negotiations collapsed, and both men returned to their camps and knowing the die was cast. Carthage was now caught between Hannibal's determination and her own political fragility. Rome was united, but Carthage was fragmented. Citizens feared the costs of war. Elites squabbled, allies defected. Carthage faced not only enemies from without, but division within. Rome entered the battle with full commitment. Carthage entered it with hesitation, trying to hide it beneath Hannibal's command. When we speak of Zama, we imagine elephants charging, infantry clashing, cavalry wheeling. But remember, the true skeleton of that battle was forged in chambers of politics, in bitter Senate debates, in Massinissa's calculations, in Hannibal's unwilling recall. The armies were flesh, but the intent behind their placement was born in conversation and compromise, hesitation and gamble. Every politician in Rome and Carthage had played a part in arranging their soldiers like pieces on a board. The battlefield was the execution, but politics was the design. Think of Scipio as not only the commander of an army, but of a narrative drawn across the Mediterranean. At home, he had to outmaneuver senators who feared his ambition. Abroad, he had to bind Numidian horsemen to Rome's cause. At the same time, he had to embody Rome's resilience, to show the world that Hannibal's long shadow no longer terrified the Republic. Hannibal, for his part, carried more than the command of men. He carried the double weight of family oath and political enmity, the impossible expectation that he succeed where his city had already failed him. The political maneuvers ended where they had to, with two men, each a product of their city's strengths and weaknesses, staring across the plains of North Africa with everything still to play for. Zama was not just a collision of tactics. It was the logic of decades of politics condensed into a single afternoon. Rome's Senate, Carthage's oligarchs, Numidia's calculating kings, each had taken up invisible positions on the battlefield. When shields slammed and swords thrust, their invisible hands guided the blows. And in that intermingling of intrigue and steel, Rome never forgot its central principle. Politics served war, and war served politics. Hannibal had fought like a lion, but his city had failed him. Scipio fought with Hannibal's lessons in his mind, but behind him stood a republic united, determined, and vengeful. This was the deeper truth of Zama, not just elephants and infantry, but the brute fact that Rome's political machine had finally outweighed Carthage's hesitation. Yet even amid games of power and women and men in togas whispering behind shaded porticos, real people lived under these decisions. Soldiers, slaves, citizens, farmers, all pulled into the vortex Rome and Carthage spun around them. To see how Zama shaped the ancient world, we must shift our gaze from generals and senators to those who labored, fought, and suffered under their order. What did this clash mean for ordinary lives, for daily existence across two empires? To grasp Rome's victory, we must spend time with its people. Before the dust of Zama had even settled, before the crows began to pick at the field of the fallen, the consequences of Rome's victory rippled outward into daily lives. For while politics and generals set the grand stage, it was ordinary soldiers, citizens, slaves, and conquered peoples who bore the cost and felt the change most immediately. To understand how Rome became what it did, we must step away from the clamor of Senate debates and battlefield horns and enter the kitchens, barracks, and farms where ordinary Romans and Carthaginians carried the weight of empire. Picture a Roman legionary returning home after years abroad, his sandals worn, his gladius pitted from combat. He had marched across Spain, possibly bled in Africa, and survived an ordeal that claimed so many of his comrades. When he returned to his farm in Latium or Campania, he might find fields that had lain fallow, his family barely surviving under the strain of missed harvests, his children strangers to him after years of absence. This was the most common thread of Roman victory, victory paid for in the coin of ordinary men, whose absence weakened the countryside but strengthened the Republic's military grip. War wasn't just something Rome fought. War was something Rome lived. For soldiers in camp, daily life was harsh, monotonous, and unrelenting. They dug ditches, built fortifications, maintained their weapons, and practiced drills until their bodies ached. The discipline that had held firm at Zama was nurtured not by great speeches, but by endless repetition. Archaeology of Roman camps shows us the same standardized layouts across continents, their grids of streets, central command tents, and perimeter walls. Soldiers could march months away from Italy and still find themselves in a familiar Roman pattern. That uniformity provided a strange comfort. No matter where they fought, they were at home inside the war machine. For many Carthaginian mercenaries, life looked very different. They fought for coin, not duty, and after Zama, those coins grew scarce. Many were cast adrift, unpaid and unwanted, wandering the Mediterranean as swords for hire or bandits on the margins of empire. Loyalty was temporary, fate often pitiless. Hannibal had relied on their skill, but in defeat they saw their contracts evaporate like smoke. For them, politics stripped away livelihoods. For their families, Carthage's failure meant starvation. Among ordinary Roman citizens, the war reshaped daily rhythms. Women bore the brunt of absence, running farms and businesses, while husbands and sons marched. Slaves carried heavier loads, their numbers swelling as Rome conquered abroad and transported thousands into Italian households. Victory at Zama meant not only peace for Rome, but also a sudden influx of Carthaginian prisoners, who became unfree laborers, tilling fields near the very farms their masters had once abandoned for war. A Roman matron might spend her day overseeing both land and slaves, weaving the costs of empire directly into her family's survival. Wealth grew but unevenly. Great patrician families profited handsomely from new estates carved from conquered lands, swelling their power within the Senate. The plebeians, the ordinary class of citizens, often found themselves displaced, their small plots too ruined to recover after years of neglect. Many ended up in cities as urban poor, swelling the number of citizens who no longer farmed, but who clamored for bread, coin, and political voice. Thus, Rome's military victories, while glorious abroad, sowed seeds of new internal tensions at home. The conquered peoples felt the weight even more. In North Africa, Carthage continued to exist after Zama, but as a shadow of its former self. Hefty indemnities were imposed, yearly repayments that bled wealth from the city. Carthage was forbidden to wage war without Rome's permission. Its once proud fleet, which had dominated the Western Mediterranean, was reduced to a handful of token ships. Traders and farmers alike watched their prospects dwindle as the empire of commerce shrank into vassalage. For a Carthaginian craftsman, defeat meant fewer markets. For a sailor, it meant unemployment in a port where shipyards grew silent. Zama's chains were not only political, but daily and economic. And yet Rome had its own methods for weaving conquered peoples into its orbit. Unlike many empires, the Republic offered an alluring prize: incorporation. Not always, not equally, but often enough to bind subject communities. Allies could gain partial citizenship, the right to trade, and protection under Rome's treaties. This carrot balanced the stick of severe punishment for disloyalty. Cities that resisted were sacked, fields burned, noble families enslaved. Others, which bent the knee, found themselves slowly drawn into Rome's growing network of rights and privileges. It was a strategy of both terror and seduction, integration that turned conquered enemies into future. Consider Italy itself. Cities that sided with Hannibal often suffered brutally once Rome regained control, their lands confiscated, their elites stripped of titles. Those that remained loyal, on the other hand, were rewarded with favor, credit, and protection. Daily life for an Italian ally thus hinged on political calculation: stand with Rome and survive, or risk destruction by supporting Carthage. It was a cruel gamble, often paid in lives and livelihoods long after battlefields grew silent. For the common Roman, however, there was also pride. War was woven into identity. To be Roman was to endure, to sacrifice land and sons for the greater republic. Religion reinforced this. Temples multiplied after victories, offerings flowed to Jupiter and Mars as thanks for survival. Veterans returned bearing scars as proof of devotion, proof they had stood in the shield line that saved Rome. Festivals echoed with chants of triumph, retelling victories in ways that children absorbed at an early age. Even absence became identity. My father died at Cannae. My brother never returned from Africa. These refrains became badges of belonging in a city that defined itself by enduring loss and still prevailing. But do not imagine Roman daily life as only shadows of grim sacrifice. Conquest brought wealth, new foods, new slaves, new possibilities. African grain flowed to feed Roman bellies. Exotic animals appeared in triumphal processions. And families might display conquered statuary or colorful mosaics captured abroad. Rome's very culture expanded by osmosis, its daily sights and sounds transforming as empire grew. To eat, to dress, even to decorate one's home increasingly meant living with the spoils of Carthage, Spain, or Greece. What began as survival became appetite. There was, of course, also the darker face of this system. For every Roman feasting on African grain, slaves harvested it in chains. For every patrician displaying Carthaginian art, a Carthaginian family mourned ruin. Daily life for the enslaved was a bleak monotony of labor, broken only by the cruelty of masters or the crushing weight of exhaustion. The wealth that gilded Rome's future was built on the backs of those whose voices history rarely records. They were as much part of the Roman machine as any legionary, their toil enabling the Republic's elites to wage wars without pause. Zama thus marked not only a turning point in strategy, but in lived reality for millions. For Roman citizens, it brought both pride in widening inequality. For Carthaginians, it brought humiliation in the slow suffocation of a once great city. For slaves and conquered peoples, it meant new chains. Every shield raised at Zama, every sword thrust that day, reverberated into hearths, kitchens, and furrowed fields. This was the world Rome carried forward into its next phase, confident, ambitious, but changing at its core. The daily lives of ordinary people reflected both the triumph and the costs of constant conflict. And while Rome stood stronger than ever before, victory did not come without seeds of transformation, seeds that would one day grow into new dangers. Because war builds empires, but it also changes them. Rome's victory over Hannibal marked the birth of dominance, but within that birth lurked the very changes that would one day challenge the Republic itself. To see this clearly, we must turn to the next great pivot point, the subtle moment when Rome's strength, having reached its peak, began to carry within it the weight of its own decline. Victory at Zama seemed to Romanize like the turning of the world itself. For the first time, the Republic stood not just as the survivor of Hannibal's war, but as the unchallenged power of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage had been humbled, paying indemnities and stripped of its fleet. Hannibal himself was left politically isolated, forced into exile by the very city he had spent his life trying to save. In Rome, triumphs were celebrated, temples were raised, and Scipio bore the name Africanus, his reputation sealed as the man who had broken Rome's greatest enemy. And yet beneath this dazzling moment of glory lay shadows, turning points, subtle fractures, and consequences that neither Scipio nor his Senate could fully perceive. The war that had secured Rome's dominance had also planted the beginnings of change that would eventually transform the Republic forever. Let us stand at that moment in 202 BCE after Hannibal had fled the field of Zama. Rome could now impose conditions without restraint. Carthage was barred from raising armies without Rome's permission, condemned to tribute payments that bled its wealth year after year. Its ambitions were gone, its future stunted. Rome not only removed a rival, but reshaped an entire balance of power. Yet in doing so, it learned habits that were as dangerous to its long-term survival as Hannibal's elephants had once been. The Republic found not just strength, but appetite. Until the Second Punic War, Rome's wars had often been defensive or regional. They fought neighbors, claimed territory, and returned with modest gains. But after Zama, Rome understood empire in a new way. Victory no longer meant survival, it meant dominance. Expansion went from necessity to expectation. Senators, generals, and citizens increasingly saw warfare as a pathway to wealth, prestige, and everlasting glory. What had been emergency mobilization against Hannibal hardened into a permanent military culture, a republic whose calendar seemed forever inked with campaigns. Scipio himself embodied this shift, bearing not only the authority of a victorious general, but wielding influence that unsettled the delicate balance of Rome's political order. Some senators whispered bitterly, fearing he was becoming too popular, too essential, a man closer to monarch than magistrate. For in Rome, success was as dangerous as failure. To shine too brightly carried suspicion. The triumph of Zama did not only end Carthage's threat, it highlighted the tension between Rome's devotion to Republican tradition and its growing reliance on extraordinary men, a tension that would one day culminate in Caesars and emperors. Meanwhile, the turning point for Hannibal was even more tragic. He had devoted his entire life to Rome's destruction, only to return to Carthage defeated in his greatest gamble. In the years after Zama, he attempted to reform the Carthaginian state, curbing corruption and seeking financial recovery. His reforms threatened the entrenched elite, who responded by undermining him, eventually forcing him into exile. The man who had nearly crushed Rome wandered foreign courts, advising Eastern kings but never regaining his grandeur. His exile symbolized not just the fall of a man, but the end of a Carthaginian dream. Carthage, once a titan of the seas and a terror of Italian soil, was reduced to submission, and Hannibal himself became a political refugee. For Rome, this was triumph. For Hannibal and Carthage, it was the bitterest of turning points. Yet Rome's triumphalism had consequences, even in victory. The very system that had made Rome resilient during Hannibal's invasions, broad citizen service, discipline born of necessity, the willingness to endure loss, began to erode as Rome gained wealth and power. Farmers who had fought abroad returned to ruined lands, many unable to rebuild. Great patrician families swallowed these small farms into massive estates worked by slaves captured in war. The agricultural core of Rome's citizen army, its backbone for centuries, weakened. Zama had secured Rome's dominance, but it also accelerated the social transformation from a republic of citizen farmers to one of estates and urban masses. Here then lies the irony. Hannibal had been forced into Carthage's service reluctantly, restrained by his own Senate, undermined by political hesitation. Rome's Senate, by contrast, gained confidence, discovering that decisive generals could deliver unprecedented rewards. This imbalance set the Republic on a course where politics bent more and more toward military conquest, where victories generated demand for more victories. Rome had discovered not only that it could survive annihilation, it had discovered the intoxicating taste of being unbeatable. And from taste came hunger. Imagine the position of Scipio, lauded as savior yet quietly feared. He held the loyalty of legions, the adoration of the public, and the grudging admiration of even those who had doubted him. Was he now greater than the Republic itself? The Senate attempted to rein him in, stripping him of command, challenging his policies. But the pattern they set would echo through the decades. Rome rewarding generals with immense prestige, then fearing their consequence. Scipio himself would eventually retire, but the pathway to Pompey, Caesar, and Augustus began here, in the afterglow of Zama, when Rome realized individuals could bend the fate of the world through military genius. The consequences for Carthage proved enduring. Though the city was spared immediate destruction, its subjugation was so thorough that within 50 years Roman senators openly clamored for its total eradication, fearing any revival of strength. The seeds of the Third Punic War lay buried already in the peace terms of 202. Zama had broken Carthage's sword, but even a disarmed Carthage was judged too dangerous to exist. The battle, victorious though it was, did not end enmity. It froze it into a hateful memory. The turning point then was not only Rome's rise or Carthage's fall, it was the pivot of the entire Mediterranean world. Power shifted irrevocably westward. Rome assumed the mantle of arbiter, its voice decisive in Spain, in North Africa, and soon in Greece in the east. A republic that had begun as a city-state on the Tiber now extended its hands across seas, shaping the destinies of nations. Hannibal's defeat did not merely safeguard Rome's survival, it triggered the transformation of Rome into the master empire of antiquity. And yet, there was price and irony beneath the triumph. Carthage's fate showed how political hesitation cripples genius. Rome's fate showed how success reshapes institutions in ways not easily controlled. The republic that emerged from Zama was no longer the same one that had quelled at Cannae. It was stronger, richer, more ambitious, but also more restless, more unequal, and more vulnerable to the seductive power of warlords who promised to command its destiny. This is why historians look back at Zama as both an ending and a beginning. The Second Punic War ended, and with it, Rome's century-long duel with Carthage. But something new began. The expansion of Rome far beyond Italy, and with it, the long, slow unraveling of a republic that found it easier to conquer the world than to govern itself. The triumph over Hannibal was dazzling, but hidden in its brilliance was change that would, in time, darken the republic's future. So as Hannibal rode away from Zama, beaten but not dishonored, and Scipio was hailed as Africanus, champion of Rome, both men perhaps felt they had shaped destiny itself. They had, but destiny is rarely what men intend. Rome's greatest victory was also the moment it crossed a line, a turning point from which it would never return. The smoke of Zama faded quickly into memory, but its consequences stretched across centuries. Rome did not simply win a battle that day, it reshaped the destiny of the Mediterranean and, by extension, the wider world. What was decided on those African plains reverberates into our very age, in the politics of empire, in the lessons of resilience, and in the ghosts of collapsed powers. Zama was more than a turning point in war. It was the beginning of a new world order. The immediate consequence for Carthage was humiliation. Though the city was allowed to exist, its wings had been clipped, its claws dulled. Carthage was forbidden from waging any foreign war without Rome's consent. Its fleet, once the most formidable naval force of the Western Mediterranean, was dismantled down to a token handful of ships. A crushing indemnity was imposed, and to be paid over 50 years, tribute not only in silver but in submission. Carthage became less a rival state and more a client locked under Rome's shadow. And though it survived, it no longer threatened. Merchants still traded, farmers still harvested, but a palpable air of resignation settled over the city. To Carthaginian children born after 202 BCE, war against Rome was no longer a dream. It was a memory recounted by bitter elders, and a warning of what defying Rome would cost. Rome, by contrast, emerged with pride swelling greater than ever before. The Republic was no longer merely a regional Italian power. She was now the arbiter of the Mediterranean West. Respect turned to fear, allies turned to clients, and foreign kings took cautious stock of a republic that had risen from the edge of ruin to reign supreme. Spain fell fully under Roman dominion, rich in silver mines that funded further expansion. Numidia, under Massinissa, became a loyal and powerful ally, securing Rome's southern flank. The Mediterranean, once a fractured chessboard, now tilted heavily toward Roman control. But beyond borders and treaties, the legacy of Zama was psychological. The fear that Rome had felt after Cannae, the dread of annihilation, melted into confidence. Confidence hardened into expectation. From this point onward, Rome stopped imagining survival as her chief concern. She expected domination. Generals campaigned not simply to defend the Republic, but to grasp glory and extend its sphere. When Scipio Africanus returned home, his very name embodied this change. Conquered lands became titles. Roman commanders now measured themselves not just by defense of the city, but by how much of the world they could bring under its command. The world, too, shifted. Greek states watched Rome with wary fascination, realizing that the legions forged in struggle with Carthage were now turning their hungry gaze eastward. Kings in the Hellenistic world soon clashed with Roman consuls, only to discover that the same discipline that had shattered Hannibal's veterans could devastate phalanxes and cavalry in Greece and Asia. Zama did not just humble Carthage, it unshackled Rome for global conquest. The archaeological record even whispers the echoes of this turning point. Roman fortresses in Spain, standardized coinage imprinted with glory, inscriptions of triumphs carried in parades, all trace their origins to the wealth, confidence, and imperial outlook born from Zama. Excavations near Carthage uncover Punic households continuing in reduced, diminished form, their pottery and trade goods thinner, humbler, marked by a long decline. Where once Carthage's harbors hummed with the global commerce, Rome's ports swelled with the spoils of victory. The imbalance is visible even in what the ground preserves. Yet Zama carried not only triumphs and monuments, it also etched lessons that military thinkers still study. The reversal of Cannae, the deflection of elephants, the encirclement turned upon Hannibal himself, all became blueprints of adaptability. Proof that armies succeed not when their plans are flawless, but when they learn from disaster. Many centuries later, generals from Frederick the Great to Napoleon reflected on Hannibal and Scipio alike, seeing in their duel not only skill, but the relentless rhythm of war itself. Innovate, counter, adapt. Consider what Scipio's strategy really proved. Rome could endure catastrophic defeat not once but many times and still prevail. This resilience, this iron refusal to yield even after disasters like Cannae, became a model studied by empires to come. It is a stark warning from history. Strength does not lie only in victory, but in the ability to bleed, stagger, and still rise. Rome's enemies learned this too late. Modern leaders continue to wrestle with the same truth. For Rome's own citizens, though, the change was double-edged. Triumph poured treasures into the city, silver from mines, grain from Africa, slaves from conquest. The temples of Jupiter and Mars gleamed with offerings brought home by victorious generals. Rome must have seemed invincible, but in prosperity lurked decay. Wealth widened the gap between patricians and plebeians. Veterans returned to find their modest farms consumed by estates of the wealthy, who filled them with slave labor captured abroad. The very engine of citizen soldiers that had won at Zama would, within generations, erode into legions loyal more to commanders than to the Republic. Carthage's suffering, Rome's triumph, the world's recalibration, all were obvious consequences. But the deeper consequence lurked unseen. the transformation of Rome from a republic fighting for its life into a hegemon eager to wield empire. That change would ripple until the days of Caesar and Augustus, until chronic warfare and personal ambition would transform the republic into monarchy in all but name. Still, in that moment of victory, such concerns hardly troubled the Roman crowd. They saw only vindication. The man who once terrorized their fields had been beaten. Songs and festivals glorified Scipio. Statues were raised, sacrifices offered. For decades afterward, Rome looked back at Zama not as a warning, but as a triumph of destiny. Carthage became a byword for lost greatness, later obliterated entirely in the Third Punic War. Rome became the standard by which others measured power. So what is the historical impact of that day? Carthage's defeat ensured that Latin, not Punic, would become the dominant voice of Mediterranean administration and culture. It ensured that Rome, not Carthage, would transmit its laws, its roads, its legions, and its architecture across Europe, North Africa, and beyond. The Western world as we know it, its languages, its governments, its very conception of empire, owes much to a dusty plain in Africa where elephants trumpeted and legions held firm. Think then of the lesson. Carthage had in its grasp the greatest military genius of antiquity, but its politics chained him until it was too late. Rome suffered disasters that would annihilate other powers, yet refused to acknowledge defeat. Which of these two societies endured? That is the enduring impact of Zama, proof that genius can win battles, but only systems, resilience, and unity can win wars. And so the story of Scipio and Hannibal ends not with them, but with us, because their legacy is still alive. The battle's consequences echo through our architecture, our language, our strategies, our very idea of what it means to be a superpower. To this day, Zama speaks with an unquiet voice: adapt or perish, endure or be broken. Rome listened and survived. Carthage hesitated and was erased. But there is one more strand to pull, beyond consequences, beyond empire and ruin. What do these ancient events mean to us now? What parallels lie in our own age, when nations rise and fall, when political divisions hamper action, when the very strengths that create dominance may also plant the seeds of decline? To complete this story, we must step out of antiquity and into the reflections of the present. What then does Zama mean to us, 2 millennia later? Why linger on Hannibal's defeat and Scipio's triumph when both men, their cities, and their armies turned to dust centuries ago? The answer is simple. Because the logic of Zama is not confined to the ancient world. It is a story about how nations endure catastrophe, how leaders adapt to crises, and how empires win not only by brilliance, but by resilience. The echoes of that African plain still rumble in our decisions today. When Rome staggered after Cannae, observers across the Mediterranean believed the Republic finished. By every conventional measure, it should have been. Its armies decimated, its allies wavering, its fields ravaged by Hannibal's marauding veterans, Rome looked broken. Yet survival did not come from luck. It came from a culture that refused to quit, even when the odds mocked them. They raised new armies, rebuilt shattered alliances, and kept fighting when logic itself said surrender would be safer. This ability to absorb loss and transmute it into resolve is what made Rome invincible. For modern societies, whether political, economic, or military, the lesson is painfully clear. Strength lies not only in victory, but in the ability to face calamity, to stagger under the blow, and to endure. For Hannibal, Zama demonstrates the limits of individual genius. No commander has ever executed encirclement as perfectly as he did at Cannae. No strategist has ever marched an army across the Alps in such audacious style. Yet without the full weight of a united Carthage behind him, his brilliance was wasted. His Senate hesitated, his elites squabbled, his alliances faltered, and his soldiers grew thin with neglect. In the end, Rome survived not because Hannibal failed on the field, but because Carthage failed at home. Here lies another lesson all too relevant today. Even the greatest leaders cannot compensate for a divided or short-sighted polity. Genius without unity is fragile. Brilliance without support is doomed. And for Scipio, Zama is a lesson in learning. He had watched Rome bleed under Hannibal, had seen firsthand the slaughter at Cannae. Unlike so many others, he did not simply crave vengeance. He studied his enemy, absorbed Hannibal's methods, and turned them against him. The students of defeat, he proved, are often the authors of victory. His plan at Zama was not improvisation but adaptation, a carefully crafted answer to every problem his enemy posed. That principle remains timeless. It is not perfection that guarantees triumph, but the capacity to evolve faster than the challenges you face. Archaeology lends its quiet testimony to this story. The ruins of Carthage, burned and later rebuilt by Rome, whisper the fragility of greatness. The standardized Roman camps unearthed across continents speak to the machine forged in these wars. The inscriptions of triumph remind us how much societies hunger for stories of victory, sometimes forgetting that in those victories lurk the seeds of future troubles. Zama lives not only in chronicles but in the stones, coins, and remnants that still survive. Objects that tell us empires are built by ordinary hands, sustained by structures larger than any one man. Perhaps the most haunting modern relevance lies in how triumph alters institutions. Rome's victory brought confidence, and confidence brought expansion, wealth, and a taste for empire. Yet the very inequalities seeded by conquest, the concentration of land in a few hands, the reliance on slave labor, the growing gap between generals and their state, would one day strain the republic beyond repair. Zama was both Rome's vindication and the beginning of Rome's transformation. From it arose the long chain that would eventually lead through Marius and Sulla, to Pompey and Caesar, to Augustus and the empire. Victory over Carthage secured Rome's supremacy, but it also pointed the republic toward its own destruction. Triumph can be the harbinger of decline. And there is one final question history leaves us to ponder. What if Hannibal's city had supported him with full measure? What if Carthage had reinforced him after Cannae? Would Latin rather than Punic still dominate Western civilization? Would Roman law and language, Roman roads and architecture still form the backbone of Europe? Or would another tradition have filled that space? History is not inevitable. Its paths pivot on choices. Zama reminds us that a few critical moments, born of politics as much as combat, can redirect centuries. So when we speak of Zama, we are not only speaking of Hannibal and Scipio, we are speaking of endurance, of the power of unity, of the peril of hesitation, and of the double-edged nature of victory. We are speaking of lessons that ring in boardrooms and parliaments, that echo in war rooms and in crumbling states alike. Rome became Rome because it refused to die when death seemed certain. Carthage fell because it feared the cost of total commitment. Between them, Scipio and Hannibal personify these forces. One the genius unfulfilled, the other the student who learned from catastrophe and remade his world. The plain of Zama is quiet now. Crops grow where once elephants trampled and swords clashed. The cries of soldiers are long gone, but the pattern they wrote in blood remains with us. Civilization is always one disaster away from collapse, one hesitation away from defeat. Yet it is also one act of resilience away from greatness. Rome endured, learned, adapted, and for centuries conquered. Carthage faltered, divided, and vanished. Those are the final words Zama gives us. The call is as clear today as it was then. Endure, adapt, commit fully, or be consigned to the memory of others. Rome listened and ruled the world.